Her ex-husband mocked her in court, but when she spoke, the judge's reaction stunned everyone. The courtroom was filled with an unsettling silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers and hushed whispers between attorneys. A woman sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped together, her fingers intertwined so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Across from her, her ex-husband leaned back in his chair, a smug grin stretching across his face. He looked confident, almost amused, as if the entire trial was nothing more than a formality, one that would end exactly as he planned. She had prepared herself for this day, knowing that humiliation was inevitable. Her ex-husband had spent years belittling her, stripping away her confidence bit by bit until she could barely recognize herself. And now, here they were, in front of a judge, finalizing a divorce that had already cost her more than she could bear. He had fought ruthlessly to ensure she walked away with nothing, claiming she was incapable, useless, undeserving of anything he had built. She had spent years as a devoted wife, supporting him through everything, yet he acted as if she were an inconvenience, someone to be discarded without a second thought. His attorney stood and cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client has been more than generous. He has provided financial support beyond what was necessary. The plaintiff has contributed little, if anything, to the marriage. She was never employed, never brought in income, and relied entirely on my client's hard work." He smirked as he continued, "She has no real skills, no experience, and no prospects. She's simply demanding money because she knows she won't survive without my client's generosity." A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. The woman felt her stomach tighten, but she forced herself to remain composed. This wasn't the time to react. Not yet. She exhaled slowly, her gaze steady as she watched her ex-husband revel in his false victory. He had underestimated her. That would be his biggest mistake. There was a time when she believed in love, in the promises of forever. She had met him when she was young and full of hope, drawn to his charm and effortless confidence. He was ambitious, a rising star in the corporate world, and he made her feel like she was the only woman in the world. In the beginning, he had showered her with affection, whispering sweet words about the future they would build together. She had given him everything, her heart, her trust, her unwavering support. But as the years passed, the cracks in their marriage became too deep to ignore. He no longer looked at her with admiration but with indifference, as if she were an obligation rather than a partner. The small insults had turned into biting remarks, and the once loving words were replaced with criticisms. "You wouldn't last a day without me," he would say. "You're lucky I married you, or you'd be nothing." At first, she convinced herself he didn't mean it, that stress had hardened him, but deep down, she knew better. He had always controlled everything, their finances, their social circles, even how she spent her days. He made sure she never worked, claiming he wanted to provide for her, but the truth was, he didn't want her to have independence. He wanted her dependent on him, helpless without him. It wasn't love, it was control, a carefully designed trap. And now, sitting in court, she realized he still thought he held all the power. He had no idea what was coming. It hadn't happened all at once. The erosion of her confidence was slow, like waves wearing down stone over time. The first time he mocked her in front of friends, she had laughed along, convincing herself it was just a joke. The first time he dismissed her ideas, she had told herself he was just under stress. But each time she excused his behavior, he took a little more from her, her voice, her self-worth, her ability to stand tall without fear. She stopped recognizing herself. The woman who once had dreams of her own had been replaced by someone who second-guessed everything. She hesitated before speaking, afraid of saying the wrong thing. She avoided social events, knowing he would find something to criticize later. The world outside their home became smaller and smaller, until she existed only within the confines of his expectations. But one night changed everything. She overheard him on the phone, laughing with a friend. "She's so clueless," he had said. "She actually thinks I'll support her after the divorce? Please. She'll crawl back when she realizes she's got nothing." That was the moment something inside her snapped. He thought she was weak. He thought she would beg. He thought she had no way out. He was wrong. The next morning, she had done something she had never done before. She went behind his back. She had always played the role of the obedient wife, trusting that he would handle everything. But that day, she met with an attorney. And when she laid out her story, the attorney had looked at her, silent for a moment before saying, "You have more power than you think." She learned things she had never known before about assets, hidden accounts, legal rights. He had spent years keeping her in the dark, but knowledge was a light that couldn't be extinguished. As the attorney outlined the case, she realized something startling. He wasn't as invincible as he believed. He had left behind traces, evidence of his deception. She had walked out of that office with a plan, a strategy. Her ex-husband had spent years ensuring she felt powerless, but the truth was, he had been the one relying on her ignorance. Now, as she sat in court, she held something he wasn't expecting: proof. Proof of his lies, his manipulation, his hidden wealth. And she would reveal it at the perfect moment. She knew he would fight. He had spent too long crafting his perfect image to let her tear it down so easily. His arrogance wouldn't allow him to believe she was capable of winning. He assumed she would break, that she would settle for whatever scraps he threw her way. But he had underestimated her resilience. For months, she had played the role he expected, pretending to be lost, overwhelmed. She let him believe he was winning, that she was too weak to fight back. All the while, she was gathering everything she needed. Bank statements, business records, financial discrepancies, each piece of evidence was another crack in the foundation of his lies. And now, in this courtroom, she was ready. He sat across from her, smirking, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. She could feel the weight of the moment, the anticipation building. The judge was about to rule in his favor, just as he expected. But then she stood up, calm, composed, and said the words that changed everything. He had always been a man who thrived on control, someone who dictated every aspect of their life together. So, when she first filed for divorce, he had laughed, believing it to be nothing more than a temporary rebellion. He assumed she would come crawling back, apologizing, begging for forgiveness. But as the proceedings progressed, something shifted. He saw that she wasn't faltering. She wasn't pleading for his approval. Instead, she was standing firm, making demands, and refusing to bow to his intimidation. In his desperation, he did what he always did: he retaliated. He used his connections to manipulate the legal system, dragging out the process, draining her financially and emotionally. He hired private investigators, hoping to find something, anything, that could be used against her. He spread rumors, ensuring that their mutual acquaintances saw her as an unstable, ungrateful woman who had turned on her devoted husband. But for the first time, his tactics didn't work. No matter how much he tried to rattle her, she remained unmoved. That terrified him. For years, he had controlled the finances with an iron grip, always ensuring she had just enough to survive but never enough to have independence. Every credit card was in his name, every investment tied to his accounts. He had made sure that, on paper, she was nothing more than a dependent. He thought that without access to his wealth, she would be powerless. But what he failed to realize was that she had been quietly preparing. She had spent months working with a forensic accountant, uncovering discrepancies in his finances, hidden accounts, undeclared assets, and offshore transfers. Every document she uncovered was another nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed image. And now, she had what she needed. She wasn't just fighting for alimony, she was proving that he had engaged in financial fraud. He had painted her as a helpless woman, but now, the evidence in her hands proved that he was the one who should be afraid. The moment the judge announced the final hearing date, she saw it, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had always been so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to manipulate every situation. But this time, something was different. He had expected a simple divorce, a routine proceeding where he could walk away victorious. Instead, he was facing a woman he no longer recognized. She wasn't the quiet, obedient wife who once tiptoed around his moods. She sat across from him with an unreadable expression, her back straight, her hands steady. He knew she had something, but he didn't know what. The uncertainty was eating at him, and for the first time in years, he was the one feeling powerless. She didn't need to say a word, her silence was enough to make him nervous. He had set the stage for this battle, but now, he wasn't sure he was going to win. In a final act of desperation, he resorted to lies. He stood in court, speaking with the same confidence that had once made her believe every word he said. He told the judge that she had been emotionally unstable, unfit to manage her own affairs. He claimed that he had supported her for years out of kindness, out of duty, and that she was now repaying him with betrayal. His attorney echoed his words, painting a picture of a man who had done nothing but love a woman who was incapable of appreciation. She sat in silence, letting him speak, watching as he dug his own grave with every word. He thought he was controlling the narrative, that his performance would sway the judge. But what he didn't realize was that she was waiting. When he was finished, when the courtroom had fallen into hushed anticipation, she simply smiled. And then, she pulled out the documents. Bank statements. Financial transfers. Proof of everything he had denied. The weight of the truth was about to crush him. The judge's gaze shifted from her to her ex-husband, scanning the papers in front of him with a slow, deliberate intensity. The room was silent, the air thick with the anticipation of an unexpected turn. He had been so sure of himself, so confident that his lies would be enough to dismiss her claims. But now, as the judge flipped through page after page of undeniable proof, that confidence began to wither. His expression stiffened, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. She took a deep breath and spoke, her voice steady. "Your Honor, my ex-husband has portrayed himself as a generous provider, a man burdened by a wife who contributed nothing. But these records tell a different story. Offshore accounts, falsified income reports, misappropriated funds, this is not a man who was honest with his finances. And if he can lie about this, then I ask, what else has he lied about?" The murmur that followed was deafening. The power had shifted. For the first time, he was the one on trial. His attorney scrambled to regain control, launching into a frantic attempt to dismiss the evidence as irrelevant. "This is a divorce case, not a financial investigation," he argued, his voice cracking slightly under pressure. "This information has nothing to do with the division of assets." But the judge wasn't convinced. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. "Actually," the judge said slowly, this information changes everything." Her ex-husband's jaw clenched, his smugness dissolving into thinly veiled panic. She had never seen him this way before, off balance, unprepared. He was a man who thrived on being in control, but now, control had slipped through his fingers like sand. She saw it in his clenched fists, in the twitch of his jaw. He had always told her she was nothing without him. But now, in this courtroom, it was clear he was the one who couldn't survive without his lies. News of the trial had begun to spread, and by the next hearing, the courtroom was filled with more than just legal professionals. Reporters, spectators, and former acquaintances sat in silent anticipation, eager to witness the downfall of a man who had always presented himself as untouchable. He had spent years cultivating a pristine reputation, ensuring that his success was visible to everyone. But now, his carefully constructed empire was crumbling in front of an audience. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she remained calm. This was his humiliation, not hers. She had spent years enduring his condescension, his belittlement, his calculated cruelty. But today, she was no longer the woman he could manipulate behind closed doors. Today, he was the one exposed. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder as the judge prepared to speak. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. The judge removed his glasses and set them carefully on the bench, his fingers steepling as he studied the man before him. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his tone slow and deliberate, "you have repeatedly claimed that your wife was financially dependent, incapable of managing money, and undeserving of assets. Yet these records tell a very different story." He tapped the thick stack of documents before him, his expression unreadable. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the weight of an unraveling lie. Her ex-husband shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance giving way to barely concealed anxiety. His lawyer, sensing the shift in momentum, leaned in and whispered something hurriedly, but the damage was already done. His confidence had been his greatest weapon, and now it was crumbling. The judge continued, his voice firm. "This court takes financial misconduct seriously. Before we proceed further, I want an explanation for these discrepancies." A wave of murmurs rippled through the room. He had walked into this trial expecting a clean victory, but now, for the first time, he was the one under scrutiny. She rose slowly, her heartbeat steady despite the tension in the room. She had spent years being spoken over, dismissed, treated as if her words held no weight. But today, she would be heard. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "my ex-husband ensured that I had no access to our finances. He insisted that he alone should handle our accounts, that I was incapable of understanding investments or budgeting. Yet, as we can see, his expertise was not as flawless as he led everyone to believe." She turned toward her ex-husband then, locking eyes with him for the first time that day. "For years, I believed him. I let him control everything because I trusted that he had our best interests at heart. But that trust was misplaced. These documents proved that while he was calling me useless, he was the one hiding assets, falsifying reports, and ensuring that I had nothing while he secured his own future. He wanted me to leave this marriage with nothing, but I refused to let his lies define my worth." The murmurs grew louder. The balance of power had shifted. Her words left an impact, not just on the courtroom, but on her ex-husband himself. For the first time, there was no smug grin, no dismissive scoff. His jaw tightened, and he glanced toward his attorney, who looked equally unsettled. The judge, unimpressed by their silence, exhaled sharply and leaned forward. "Mr. Caldwell, would you care to respond?" The question was simple, but the weight behind it was immense. He cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Your Honor, this is being blown out of proportion," he muttered, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I was simply handling our finances the way I thought was best." It wasn't deception, it was financial strategy. But the words rang hollow, and he knew it. The judge arched a brow. "A strategy that involved hiding funds from your spouse during divorce proceedings?" The courtroom fell into another thick silence. His confession, though weak, had sealed his fate. The court clerk handed the judge another document, one she had been waiting for. The judge scanned the page before looking up, his expression shifting from skepticism to something resembling disappointment. "It appears," he began, voice heavy, "that a forensic audit has uncovered an undisclosed account under your name, Mr. Caldwell. An account that was not listed in your financial disclosures." The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a dense fog. Her ex-husband's face drained of color. This was no longer just about divorce, this was about financial misconduct, about legal consequences he hadn't foreseen. "That account," he started, but the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "Before you speak, I would advise you to consider your words carefully. Misrepresenting assets in court is a serious offense." The panic in his eyes was unmistakable now. He had spent so long orchestrating her downfall, never once considering that she would be the one to expose his own. The courtroom erupted in hushed whispers, the realization settling over everyone present. He had spent the entire trial calling her incompetent, yet here he was, caught in his own web of lies. The reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, eager to capture every detail of his disgrace. She remained still, composed, refusing to let herself revel in the moment. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice, about reclaiming her dignity after years of humiliation. Her ex-husband sat motionless, his once perfect composure shattered. His attorney tried to intervene, but there was no undoing what had been revealed. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom. "Given the evidence presented, I will be re-evaluating the division of assets. Additionally, I am ordering a formal investigation into potential financial misconduct." The room fell into stunned silence. He had walked into court expecting victory, but now, he was facing something far worse than losing the case. He was facing the consequences of his own arrogance. The judge leaned forward, his fingers tapping against the desk as he studied her ex-husband with an expression that made it clear he had no patience for dishonesty. "Mr. Caldwell, do you understand the severity of what has been presented here today?" His voice was steady, but the warning beneath it was unmistakable. The man who had once controlled every aspect of her life now sat frozen, unable to form a coherent response. She watched as her ex-husband struggled to find his words, his usual charm failing him. The judge continued, unfazed by the tension in the air. "Fraudulent financial disclosures are not something this court takes lightly. Depending on the findings of the investigation, you may be facing legal consequences beyond this divorce settlement." Her ex-husband swallowed hard. The courtroom that once felt like his stage now felt like a trap. He had underestimated her. And now, he was paying the price. She had spent years watching him manipulate situations to his advantage, twisting reality to fit his narrative. But here, in this moment, there was no escape. The judge's ruling was imminent, and the weight of the evidence was impossible to ignore. He had painted himself as the victim, the successful businessman shackled to a woman who contributed nothing. But the truth was exposed, he had been the one who needed her ignorance to maintain control. His hands clenched into fists as he realized there was no way out. The empire of lies he had built was collapsing around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The courtroom doors loomed behind him, but there was no exit strategy that would salvage his dignity. He had spent years making her feel powerless, but now, the tables had turned. And as the judge prepared to deliver the final decision, it was clear this was the moment he had feared all along. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a mix of shock and quiet satisfaction rippling through the spectators. Her ex-husband, once so confident, sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white against the table. His carefully crafted mask of control was slipping, and everyone could see it. The judge turned to the bailiff and nodded. "I want a full review of all financial disclosures submitted in this case. If further irregularities are found, they will be addressed accordingly." The room fell silent. Her ex-husband opened his mouth, likely to argue, to weave another lie, but his attorney placed a hand on his arm, subtly shaking his head. Even his own lawyer knew there was no recovering from this. She watched as his shoulders tensed, the realization sinking in. He had underestimated her, dismissed her as weak and incapable. But now, the entire courtroom saw the truth. He was the one who had built his success on deception, and it was all coming undone. The judge adjusted his glasses and exhaled slowly, the weight of the decision heavy in the air. Given the evidence provided, this court finds that Mr. Caldwell intentionally concealed financial assets during these proceedings. As such, I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her expression steady. She had fought too hard to let herself crumble now. Her ex-husband flinched, his jaw tightening as the judge continued. All previously contested assets will now be divided equitably, with a significant portion awarded to the plaintiff. Additionally, given Mr. Caldwell's attempts to manipulate this court, further penalties may be considered. She didn't need to look at him to know he was seething. This was the moment he had dreaded, the moment he lost control. The courtroom remained eerily silent as the judge finished reading the verdict. It was done. She had won. But instead of feeling triumphant, she felt something else, relief. For the first time in years, she was free from his grasp. No more second-guessing, no more shrinking under his cruel words. He had spent years telling her she was nothing without him, but now the world knew the truth. She had never needed him at all. As she gathered her papers, ready to leave the courtroom for the last time, she hesitated. Turning to her ex-husband, she met his glare with a calm, unwavering gaze. "You did this to yourself," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You could have let me go with dignity, but instead, you tried to destroy me. And now, you're the one left with nothing." She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and walked away, never looking back. He sat there, frozen in place, the weight of his downfall crushing him. The judge's ruling echoed in his mind, the sound of the gavel like a final nail in the coffin of his carefully constructed life. The people who had once admired him now looked at him with thinly veiled judgment, their gazes lingering just long enough to make him squirm. He had always prided himself on control, on being untouchable. But now, he was exposed, powerless. His attorney leaned in, whispering something about appealing the decision, about finding a way to salvage what was left. But he barely heard him. None of it mattered anymore. He had spent so much time tearing her down, believing that she would crumble under the weight of his cruelty. But she hadn't. She had risen, stronger than he ever imagined. And as she walked out of the courtroom, head held high, he knew he would never be able to break her again. The aftermath of the trial was swift and merciless. Word of his deception spread like wildfire. Clients pulled out of deals, business partners distanced themselves, and his name, once synonymous with success, became a whispered cautionary tale. He had built his reputation on the illusion of power, but now, that illusion had shattered, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth. He wasn't the brilliant businessman he claimed to be. He was a fraud. She watched it unfold from a distance, no longer affected by his fate. She had spent too many years living in his shadow, believing the lies he told her. But now, standing on her own, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: peace. He had lost everything, and yet, she didn't feel the satisfaction she once thought she would. Because in the end, this was never about revenge. It was about reclaiming herself. And that, she had done. Her ex-husband had always been the center of attention, the man who commanded the room with his presence. But now, in the wake of his disgrace, he found himself surrounded by silence. The phone calls stopped. The invitations disappeared. The friends who had once laughed at his jokes now avoided his gaze. He had spent years building his world, only to watch it crumble in a matter of days. And yet, even in his lowest moment, he refused to acknowledge his own role in his downfall. He told himself it was temporary, that he would rebuild. But deep down, he knew the truth: his power had come from deception, and now that deception had been exposed. The silence that surrounded him wasn't just from others. It was the silence of a man realizing, for the first time, that he had truly lost everything. The last time she stepped into the courtroom, it was to finalize the division of assets. The judge's words were firm, his tone leaving no room for argument. This court finds that Mr. Caldwell's actions were not only deceitful but intentional in their harm. The final ruling stands. This matter is now closed. With that, the case was over. The legal battle that had once seemed insurmountable was now behind her. She turned to leave, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had fought for her dignity, for her freedom, and she had won. As she walked past her ex-husband, she saw the defeat in his eyes. He had once held all the power, but now, he was just a man sitting in the wreckage of his own making. And she? She was finally free. Her first night alone in her new home felt different than she expected. There was no overwhelming sense of triumph, no lingering bitterness. Instead, there was simply quiet. A peaceful, comforting quiet. She curled up on the couch, a cup of tea in her hands, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in years, she could breathe without fear. She no longer had to walk on eggshells, no longer had to second-guess every decision. She was in control now, of her life, her choices, her future. The road ahead was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had survived the storm. And now, she was ready to embrace whatever came next. She once believed that love meant sacrifice, that marriage meant enduring even when it hurt. But now, she knew better. Love should never require losing oneself. A true partnership wasn't built on control and submission but on mutual respect. She had given everything to a man who never truly saw her, and in return, he had tried to erase her. But he had failed. She had reclaimed her voice, her strength, and most importantly, her self-worth. Looking in the mirror, she no longer saw the woman he had tried to break. She saw someone stronger, wiser, someone who had fought for herself and won. She had spent years believing she was nothing without him. But now, standing on her own, she realized she had always been enough. Months passed before she heard from anyone connected to him. A mutual acquaintance reached out, offering hesitant words of regret. "I'm sorry," they had said. I should have seen what was happening. I should have believed you. She didn't need their validation, but she accepted the apology nonetheless. People were quick to believe the image he presented, and she knew now how easily illusions could be crafted. But she no longer needed their approval. She had built a life beyond their whispers, beyond the remnants of his control. And for the first time in a long time, she felt whole. With the final chapter of her past behind her, she stepped forward into her new life. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic endings. Just a woman, free at last, ready to write her own story. And this time, she was the one in control.